Stuart here. Today, HTMX plus a Python FastAPI to make a fun quiz. Here's where you can find all the code, as usual. I started getting super frustrated. I am a server-side guy. I write server. And sometimes I just need a simple UI that interacts with my API, or at least my backend. And I have tried to learn Angular, React, Vue, whatever, and did not enjoy the experience. Not a front-end guy. So I was casting around and somebody said, check out some videos on HTMX. It makes writing UIs act like the HTTP protocol is supposed to act, and it interacts with your backends in a restive way. And I went, well, that's my song. So, and I wanted something that was going to work with pretty much any backend technology. I write servers in all sorts of languages. For this demo, I did it in Python, just because A, I need all the Python practice I can get. But B, I wanted to use the project to play around with some other things, including generating documentation. And I'll do a separate video on that because the process of learning Sphinx was exciting. And I wanted to just play nice with my favorite web frameworks. So I use Google Fonts. There's a font I love called Roboto. It uses Bootstrap, etc. And I didn't want it to be sneaky. I didn't want it to do stuff behind my back. If something happened or didn't happen, it's because I wrote something. And I wanted to have a state model that made sense between the front end and the back end and manage state in an intelligent way. And since my back ends, I really don't want to be stateful. That means I wanted to manage and transfer state entirely controlled from the front end. If you're going to have state, have it live in one place. Here's the state transfer flow. And right now, this is just noise. But I want you to come back to it and maybe look at the code. But essentially, I'm stashing all my state in hidden input types. And when I want to send a piece of state, HTMX has some attributes that it supports. And one of the attributes is, I want you to send this comma list of state back to the server. And it points to the IDs of your input types. For post, there is kind of an asterisk that goes with that, which I'll point to when we get to the code. If I have a piece of HTML that I've wired HX to, and on click, it's going to send a request to the server. And I'm going to include the HX include attribute. So it's going to send things to my server. And if it's a post, it's going to come in on the expected form object that FastAPI exposes. By the way, if you're using some other framework, that's great. But almost all frameworks have a way of getting at two fundamental HTML things. One is query strings, and the other is form variables. So for post, unless you tell it differently, it sends it as form variables, which is great because I can just call request.form, and I can then go get the values. Now, here's the gotcha. The gotcha is your input, when it's translated to a form post, that is to say, multi-part form as the doc type, then you have to use the name attribute, which means, practically speaking, if you want to transfer state around, you have to make the name and ID attributes on your input type of hidden both. One is going to be the name that shows up in your Python or other backend code inside the form, because that's the way HTTP works. And the other is the ID that allows JavaScript things like HX to do a get element by ID and go get the value. Make sense? But that's all I had to do, other than wrap the whole thing in a form to send it. And so when it arrives on my server, I can just parse it out like it was any other form variable. I don't need to do anything exciting and tricky. When I want to pass state back at the end of my call to, slash whatever, I call add header, and add header is a little function that just puts the state back in a header called hx trigger. And it properly encodes the state that I want to transfer back. In this case, I had 3 variables coming in. I want 3 variables coming out. And then on my page, there is a listener. And the listener says, okay, after hx request is complete, I want you to execute this function. And what does this function do? I go and get the chunk of JSON that was encoded into the header. Why JSON? Because it's super powerful and you can have hierarchies and things like that. HTML doesn't care, just treats it as a string. As long as you don't put illegal characters into it, it's fine. And then I say, okay, well, if there was an hx trigger header element in what was sent back to me, in the head of the thing that was sent back to me, then I want to turn that into some JSON. And then I want to call getElementById and start stuffing values back into, in this case, my hidden input types. So this is astounding clean. And if you're not transferring a ton of state, or in this case, oddly, the state I send and the state I get back are I desired to be the same for simplicity, this is a very virtuous cycle. Now, obviously, if I had other form variables like other input boxes or whatever, I was filling out some sort of a form, those would show up as their own form variables. Again, all the same rules apply. You cannot have duplicate names and things like that. And you have to be careful how you, name select statements and things. But the thing behaves pretty much like you'd expect. So here's my sort of virtuous cycle of state. And you can see not super complicated, right? Once I figured it out, and the documentation, a little less than obvious, but once I debug my way through it, and I used the F12 debugger in my browser, I could see if I was creating on the request over and seeing when I got on the response back, and then, adjusted my code to fit. So having this model in mind, here's the app running. I just went into code and I started Live Server. Live Server is great for working on pages that need to interact with backends because if you make code changes in VS Code, Live Server will update the test page that you're working on or the whole site, whatever you're working on. Very nice. So I click on New Game and I get my very first question. And I, go through all the questions. Every time I click on one of the answers, it goes on to the next question. When I finally run out of questions, it'll give me the ending screen with the score, and I can say New Game and start all over again. That's the app. We're going to come back to this because I'm going to show you what happens on the wire in the F12 debugger, but give me a minute. The underlying data that drives this is a folder inside my project that contains well-formed JSON files. And the JSON files, each element in a JSON file is a quiz question. So one quiz per file and then an array of questions. And in each question, there's a question element and there's an array of possible answers, only one of which should be marked correct true. My Python server code is going to take in whatever file I've converted it for and use that file to serve up the answers. So let's go take a look at the HTML. I know the order is a little strange, but trust me, this will make sense. But you could see how this was reflected in the UI, right? Series of questions done in order. Each question is a question name and presented with a series of answers. You answered, and it told you whether you got it right or not, and gave you your next question until you ran out of questions, and then the quiz ended. That's the life cycle. So let's go look at our HTML file. I have a base that I work from when I'm starting a new HTML project that's got all my favorite things in it. It's got Bootstrap, It's got my favorite Google fonts and some other things. And all I really did to my basic template file is, which is already kind of configured correctly for Bootstrap. It's got things like care set and viewport configured, and it's splendid. And I set the title, I make a copy, I set the title, and then in this case, I'm just including all the different fonts. I'm including Bootstrap and its icons. And then I have my main class container, and it consists of a form that is a set of button groups. And if you'll remember from the UI, you get a button group up here. That's what that is. We'll drill into how the buttons work in a second. And then there's a script block in which I have a single event handler, HTMX after request. We'll drill into that in a minute. And then I include Bootstrap and HTMX scripts taken from the cloud as a CDN and cached on my machine, or indeed any user who's running its machine. Turns out the order is important. HTMX likes to be loaded last. So, pro tip number 1, make sure HTMX is loading last. And HTMX is tiny, which is astounding because one of those other frameworks significantly bigger. That's basically it. A pretty standard set of useful links and of style sheets and scripts. Then there is, as for most of my pages, I just inline a style sheet. Again, for this project, I put a lot of things in one file that a disciplined me would have broken out. Like I would have broken out these page-specific styles into a style sheet and included the style sheet to reduce the weight of this page. And so it only needed to be fetched once. But I don't have that much, and I was feeling lazy, and I wanted to make this as easy to read as I could. And so I didn't make some of the optimizations. And you'll see that in the Python code too. All the Python code's in one file. Should I have broken it out into modules? Yes. Would I have to then hassle with modules? Yes. Is it a good thing for bigger projects? Absolutely the right thing to do. Let's take a look at how fundamentally HX works. I'll use HX instead of saying the full abbreviation going forward because it's also my mnemonic for remembering the attributes on HTML elements. And it's important to know that the server doesn't know anything about HX, right? All of the HX you're ever going to write is going to be entirely in the client. I have a button for new game, which you saw. And there are, in addition to an ID and a class, because if you're a disciplined sort of person, you put IDs on everything that is targetable. Buttons are targetable, therefore they should have an ID. And a class, and the class is a composition of Bootstrap and my custom styles. So action button is one of my custom styles. Just want to tweak the appearance a little bit. So there are 3 really easy to understand HX attributes. The first attribute in any list should be HX hyphen and then the appropriate verb in lowercase. And it supports all the HTML verbs. So put, post, get, patch, delete, options, etc. If there's an HTML verb, HX supports it. And what you do is you say HX, whatever your favorite verb is, and you give it the endpoint on the server that is a relative path to a really important attribute that you should set up here. And it's this one, base. Notice that base does not have a trailing space. Now, if I were going to be doing this for realsies, this piece of index.html would be in a folder in my server project as a piece of Jinja templating or something. And when you called get slash, it would serve this up, filtering it through Jinja and replacing all the replaceable tokens like base href values or whatever else I wanted to replace. But in this case, this is the only thing I had to replace. And again, feeling a little lazy. So I told Python to serve on 8084, and I told the page that was the base path. Again, in the real world, you'd make all these things configurable you'd serve up your HTML entirely from the server. And again, you'd use something like Jinja 2 templating library to replace the values that are dynamically generated at runtime. So when this page is served back to the client, these things are replaced. If there is a sub site, right, then it should not end a trailing slash. And the reason is that our friend HX is going to do a concatenation of base, put a slash in, and then this. So just make sure that there are no path delimiters that start this if you're going to use a base path and relative paths. And I do recommend that's what you do. It makes your site so much more portable. So we have verb and we have where we're going. We're going to post to /new on the server. And then I say, I want with this request to send the value of these inputs, and HX include is fairly fussy. The element that has the ID of be done has to be a legit HTML form element. In my case, my entire state box, as you'll remember, stored as input type equals hidden. So I've got be done, next, and score. And so I'm saying, take the values of these, and these will be updated at runtime by JavaScript. So you'll see how that works. And I want you to scrape the values out of here, make a well-formed form post, because it's the post verb. If you were using get, you would put them on the query string, but it handles that. You don't need to care about it. Like, it will do that. That is what the post behavior is supposed to do, or put, and get a delete are supposed to do query string variables, and other verbs do what other variables are supposed to do. In other words, it follows the HTML convention very carefully. This is a good thing. And then I say, when that call returns, I want you to dump whatever the server sends back into the element with an ID of result. And for me, it's just an empty div. And by default, it's going to select inner.html as the property to set. So it's going to say, get element by ID debug dot inner HTML equals whatever came back from the server. And if what your server is sending back is little snippets of HTML, which is the desired thing for HX, all you have to do is just stuff it into wherever you want to stuff it into. In this case, it's the div that takes up the majority of the UI. So that's pretty easy, right? Post and put gets sent as form variables, get, delete, etc. It's query string variables. You can, of course, mix and match because query string variables are always valid for all HTML verbs. They just may be ignored. And that's the entire interaction for the new button. I mean, that is everything with sort of an asterisk. So remember, I want to send these and they'll show up as form variables for consumption by my Python program. What I do to send the state back is I set a header, and that header gets processed by this little piece of JavaScript, which is straight up JavaScript add event listener, and the events for HX are all named HTMX : something so that they are unique. And HX will wire this request up for me. I just need to provide a handler. So what does the handler do? It looks and sees if there is a header called HX trigger. And if there is one, it takes the value, parses it as JSON, and then takes the JSON data and stuffs it into the value property of getElementById, which are these hidden inputs. And it does some other stuff that does pretty UI things at the end of every request. But this is the fundamental state transfer, right? I'm sending state in query strings or form variables, depending on my verb, and I'm getting my state back as a header so that the entirety of my body can be a pure piece of HTML snippet that it can just shove into my div. Technical footnote. You can have more complex returns than that. You can have it return a multi-part object where the first part is your HTML, and then you can return some state. But if you don't have a lot of state to return, in my case, 3 ints, this is pretty slick and easy to understand, and it's really easy to debug in the F12 debugger in your favorite browser. And so life is much better. But just know that if you ever find a scenario where you need to send back a snippet of HTML or an empty HTML and a bunch of state, that JavaScript on your page is going to interpret and do something with. Because there's no point in sending back state. HX by itself will not do anything with it, but the eventing mechanism allows you to then parse what came back and do stuff. So that's the state model, round and round. And that's pretty much all there is to say about this. For the buttons that come back for each of the questions, we'll look at the code in a minute, but fundamentally, they just have these elements in them. So let's go look at the Python. Okay, bunch of import statements. Some of the more obsessive among you will say, wow, that's a really weird way to import some of those things. I did not write a single one of those because my Python environment in here is set so I can just type things or paste code in. And if it needs to have import statements added to make it work, it just does it and it doesn't ask me, which is nice because then my squiggle goes to a non-squiggle and I'm happy guy. Anyone who's programmed in FastAPI knows what the first line of code of server code is. App equals FastAPI. And because we're passing state back and forth between a server and a page, and our browsers are quite properly paranoid, you have to put in CORS middleware. And I'm going to point out that the allow portions are set to be very loose. And in production, you should have way more nuanced CORS middleware policy than this. But this is the absolute minimum you have to do to get things to work. And the only other thing you have to do is, by default, browsers, e.g. the JavaScript running in your page, cannot see headers unless you mark them to be exposed. And I need HX trigger because that's the header I'm transferring state in. I had to supply it here. A word or two about case. Originally, I just pasted HX trigger in as it appears in the documentation, which is how it's set in the HTML in the JavaScript. But I had some weirdness. And I did a little reading, and the recommendation was when you have a CORS policy, just force it to lowercase and it will be relatively good about being case insensitive. And I did, and it worked, and I stopped thinking about it. So little hint from Heloise, you can make it case literal if you want, but I've had better results with allowing it to be mixed case. And somewhere in the CORS middleware, there's a flag that tells it to be ultra strict about the casing, which is probably good security, but for this demo, I didn't bother. I generated I made some classes. Guess result is the class I pass around to pass around state on the Python side. And question and answer are actually composed using Pydantic to actually generate nice Python classes from this. So when I fetch this raw as JSON off the disk, what I get back that my app cares about is that I get an array of questions, that's a quiz, and each question has an array of answers. And because Pydantic is really cool, and because Anthropic Claude is my friend, I gave it the JSON and told it to generate the Pydantic question and answer, and it went away and did it, and I never thought about it again. But where this shows up is, if we look at the load quiz function, which takes a path to disk and says call loads. So data here would be just raw JSON. And then Pydantic does model validate on my question root object. And what I get back is an array of question, and each question containing an array of answer with nice properties and everything, and I don't have to think about it. And I really should do a video on Pydantic, and then I realized much smarter, better people than me have done a bunch of videos on Pydantic. So my advice is, if you have a schema, XML or JSON or whatever, go ask Claude to use Pydantic and ask Claude to generate the Pydantic classes for you, And when it does, it also generates all of the code that you need to automatically do that line at 133 and suck in your JSON and turn it into beautiful Pydantic objects in a hierarchy. You're so much happier. QuizfromDisk takes the name of the quiz file, which must be a valid file in the data directory underneath my application, and makes a well-formed path out of it, and then calls load quiz, returning a beautifully well-formed list of quiz. Nice Pydantic Python objects, easy to deal with. I need to get the quiz pretty much every time the server needs to service a request. And I could have done it the hard way by, I don't know, putting it in Valkey or Redis or whatever, memcached. But you know what? Python has a nice cache attribute. And if you have something that doesn't change in between invocations, like my REST API, where the quiz after it's loaded is basically always going to be the same, I call quizGet in all my helper methods to go get that list of question object that I know and love. And it only refetches it off of disk if it has a cache miss, which only happens the very first time. Now, flushing the cache is a pain because cache invalidation sucks, right? And so for me, I'd have to restart the app or restart the container or restart the host or whatever. But for my use case, it never happens. And this is the one performance optimization that I put into this code. Cache is your friend, haha, but you might want to read about how this works and how you can invalidate it. And for enterprise applications, it's not uncommon to put a private endpoint that basically instructs the running instance to dump its cache. And there's a nice way to do that, and you can read all about it. So then we have some nice helper methods. The key helper method is just breaking the problem up of composing well-formed HTML for different use cases. And so that can be returned as the body of my return from the server. If we look at, let's go look at new because it's the most easy to understand, straightforward, and relevant. When you clicked the new button, it called base +/ new, and you land here. Notice since that I'm intending to return HTML snippets from my REST API, I can make everyone's life easier and more consistent by telling it that I want the response to be an HTML response. And under the covers, FastAPI does a lot of useful things for me, including adding the right content type header and properly computing the length and a bunch of other stuff. This is a good thing. But if you're playing with HX and it doesn't seem to be working like you expect, go see what your endpoints are set to return. By the way, it's good Python practice, even though the default is JSON, to explicitly say what the response class is. So when you generate documentation using whatever your favorite tool is, that will be part of the documentation if your documentation tool is capable of reflecting on the Python, which most are. So state transfer. I go get my form. I call the form method to get a form property or form variable. And then I do exactly what you'd expect. I go get the values in each of those things, and then I use them in my business logic. We're not going to go through the business logic other than to say, this is where I'm getting the state to my Python from. Remember HX, if you're using post or put, we'll put it in a form. And you can see elsewhere where I do a get that I'm doing the same thing, but I'm getting the query string variables, and then I'm doing the same get operation on them. Also remember that for HTML form variables, it uses the name attribute and not the ID. So what that means is you've got to remember to internalize that you need to set an ID so JavaScript can do things with it quickly, because ID is the fastest way JavaScript can look up an element. And you need to set the name property so that when HX calls the verb, either as a query string parameter or as a form variable, that it actually has one, or you get state that's not sane. And then I do a bunch of business logic, blah, 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 blah. For the UI part where you have the question, you have a whole bunch of answers. Each answer is a button. Each button does a post, passing all the things that you'd expect. I just need to do the same thing. I go get the form state, and then the choice that you picked goes through as a query string. So I'm getting it from the query string. And then I do my business logic. And this method returns either end of game, if the game's over and shows the score, or it goes and gets the next question after validating how you did on this one. And there's a bunch of business logic. It's not very long. You can go read it. Point, though, is that a lot of the helper methods, like next question that you see called there, are concerned primarily with formatting whatever I'm sending back from the server in the body of the response as well-formed HTML. So, for example, make answer button is the thing that renders one answer button. And you can see, and yes, I know, I should have used string concatenation or a string builder, pardon me, instead of string concatenation. I know. Again, simplicity. I'm building up the button in all its attributes by building a well-formed button element. And yes, I could have used HTML builder or something like that. But again, simplicity. This is transparent and easy to understand and debug. There's nothing hidden going on. I'm just literally building a string that constitutes one well-formed button. But you can see what I'm doing, right? I give it a unique ID. I give it what I want it to return to, which is I want it to post back to /guest and pass in the choice that you picked, which is the index of the answers. And I want it to include some state because I don't want to lose my state tree. And I say, look, put it in # result. Except this time I'm building it server side instead of in the page. And what you get is you get this interaction, right? I click on this button. So let's go look at it in the F12 debugger. Let's go click on our friend Q. And you can see that it called, guess with a query string parameter of equals 2. And you can see that in my request header, I'm sending pretty much the standard thing, but notice that HX sent form encoded with the most modern up-to-date version, and it knew what the origin and refer were and all this good stuff. But when I go and I look at the payload element, you can see the query string and form data that got sent to /guest, which explains why I use form to get these and query string to get those. When I look at the response, you can see the body of the response is literally just a snippet of HTML that HX is going to grab and swap with the default of inner HTML. Again, you can set an attribute that changes that behavior, and this then renders in the UI. Pretty sweet. And you can see in the response header that my HX trigger was returned with my well-formed JSON, which then is interpreted by my handler by going get response handler and then parsing if I got valid JSON back, parsing the JSON, stuffing things into my hidden inputs again. So the cycle's pretty virtuous and easy to understand. And again, the gotchas are form variables come through by name. You have to allow, if you're going to pass things in response headers, you have to allow them in your CORS policy. And JavaScript interactions are, by default, the most performantly done by using the ID property. But it's pretty easy because HX pretty much does everything else that you need to do. Again, if we go back to this button, there's almost nothing to this, right? I added 1, 2, 3 attributes, and I got an application that made a round trip call to the server and stuffed the server's response back where I needed it. That is a really pleasant, once you understand the quirks of HX and, your server, in this case, Python and FastAPI, a super pleasant programming experience. It took me about 3 hours to build this the first time. If I had to do it over again, I could probably knock out the UI of my choice against a REST API that takes in all the usual parameters in the usual ways, but returns a content type of HTML that HX can just stuff into things. Now, can you make that more difficult? Yes, you can. If you have an existing REST API that returns JSON, probably the easiest thing to do is to extend it to have HX-specific methods that do whatever the unified logic is that your API implements, and does all the HTML composition in those special endpoints so that your JSON REST endpoints can stay pure JSON. Again, I didn't bother to do that for this demo because this API was built specifically and only for HX. So that's pretty much it. It's very easy to understand what is going on because fundamentally it was designed to let the servers be servers and use the affordances, in this case, FastAPI, of the technology in the way that you would expect. I didn't have to change my programming behavior at all. I'm just doing straight up FastAPI code. And the only thing that's kind of novel is instead of returning a chunk of JSON, which most of my APIs do, I turned that into a piece of HTML that HX could just swap into the UI. And one last happy reminder, CORS is not optional. This is not an OK CORS policy for anything except a demo. And if you're passing state back in one or more headers, you need to call expose headers. Just tell it that these headers are OK. So take a look at the code. Please do leave me a comment on this video if you think it's helpful or you have questions. Thank you for your kind attention.